Thank you for joining us for this exciting and very relevant conversation on the challenging issue of online gender-based violence and its connection to women's political participation. We are here in partnership with the National Democratic Institute, and my name is Theo. Hey, Taha. Thanks for joining us. He just waved. So we'll start with a round of introductions just so that you can get to know us and the work that these two women and their incredible organizations are doing to combat this very challenging issue. And then we have a few questions, and we'll leave time at the end, if there's time, for a question or two. So my name is Theo, and I'm excited to pass it first to Paulina Ibarra from Fundacion Multitudes to talk about the work that you are doing to combat online gender-based violence.
Thank you. And thank you for the introduction and for NDI to get in this panel together. I'm the executive director of Fundacion Multitudes, an organization based in Chile, but we work all over Latin America on the issue of gender, political disinformation, and its impact on democracy. So just to clarify, when we talk about online gender political violence or any form of online violence, we're definitely talking a lot more about the impact that it has on democracy than human rights. Than gender rights. So when we look at this approach, we're trying to see what's happening in the region. In 2021, we started with the Women's Observatory Against Disinformation, which actually aimed to learn more about this issue in the Global South, because when we started looking at what was available in terms of data, we realized that there was a lot of data about the North, about the impact in Europe, and very little about what was happening in the Global South. So we launched into doing a series of surveys and interviews with women parliamentarians in Chile. We reached out to all of them. They were very generous with this time and realized that 99% of them had actually been victims of gender political disinformation. And what was worse, they thought that this was normal. That was part of what was involved in being a woman in politics. And so when we look at the issue of normalization, then we figured out, or we started to think, how is this impacting women's participation in politics? And we went out and asked youth activists, what will if they had to decide to go in politics in the future, if the potential to become a victim of gender political disinformation will change their decision. And 67% of them said that if that was a possibility, then they will decide not to go into politics. And so that's how we see it in terms of how it impacts democracy and democracy resilience. And then we start digging a little bit further and deeper. And we started realizing that Latin America was the next new big frontier for two superpower countries, China and Russia, and that they had tremendous interest in Latin America in terms of natural resources management. And they were actually using this information as a form to target women in politics, and with that, trying to impact their participation in politics. So last year, and I'm not sure how many of you are aware, but last year, actually, Chile had an exit referendum that was the end or the exit for a new conventional constitution. And that went on for about 12 months prior to that referendum, and where we could all see lots of disinformation campaign towards the women participating in the Constitutional Convention. Most of them were from indigenous populations, from vulnerable groups, representatives from LGBTQ plus communities. So when we started looking, is that disinformation campaigns were specifically targeting women, their fundamental rights, with the intention of humiliating them, exposing them, and making seem as not fit for public life. And with that, the intention was basically delegitimize the Constitutional Convention process. And when we saw, and I'm going to wrap with this, was actually how economical interest from China in Chile were permeated through the use of disinformation campaigns in order for the exit referendum to be a failure. So we saw attacks on women's reproductive rights, housing, access to water, indigenous populations, communities. And I'm not sure how many of you actually follow this process, but at the end of the day, the new draft was rejected, and vastly in part because of the disinformation campaigns that were happening in Chile. And now we're carrying out all this research in Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Honduras, and hopefully soon in Guatemala and Ecuador. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And can you just let us know, where is Fundación Multitudes based?
We are based in Chile, but we work in 6 countries in the region. We have people working in the region. Yes.
Thank you so much. And our second panelist is Ixchel Garcia, working with Luchadoras. So Ixchel, can you tell us a little bit more about the work that your organization is doing to tackle this issue?
Yes, okay. It is. Well, my name is Ixchel. I'm a researcher from Luchadoras. Luchadoras is a civil organization based in Mexico City. We are a trans-feminist organization that work to defend digital rights, human rights, and gender rights. Well, first of all, to say that it's been 10 years since we celebrated Luchadora's existence. And this is important because 10 years from now, a lot of things have happened. From becoming a civil organization to being 3 people. Now we are 12 people working in Luchadoras. And also, this is one of the things we are doing on gender-based violence, is that it's been 3 years since we formed a support line against digital violence. And in these 3 years of existence, we have attended approximately 1,800 cases. This is an approximately. And now we're also there are 4 psychologists and 1 lawyer in the team of the helpline. This is important because at the beginning, Luchadoras was part of different organizations that help on cases against digital violence, like Ciberseguras. But also, like, this growth of Luchadoras made us to see it urgent to create our own support line, because a lot of people reach to us because of how it is presented to the outside. This is another thing, that is that most of our work is made on the ground. So, of course, most of the collectives that come close to us are collectives that we know from being our friends, or like from us as individuals also working on the ground, not only as members of Luchadoras, but as activists on our individuality. And well, also, in accordance to this, 5 years ago, I think in 2017, in 2017, we created the 13 forms of aggressions against women with Social TIC and APC, that's the Association for Progressive Organization. But also, it's been a long time since 2017, and now most of us, we are from different contexts also. So for us, it is important to have tools and to be able to name the violence and how it is lived context-wise. So at the moment, we are working on it. It started as an excuse to actualize this typology, but now it's being something bigger, because on the groundwork, we have found out with a lot of things that have made us question how we understand digital violence and also how we are attending it. So we are doing a research. We have just finished the first phase, it was on the ground work, where we made listening groups with different people from different parts of Mexico, like from Tijuana to the south of the border to Jaltenango. It was interesting also because it's a community in Chiapas that is like the only place where they have Wi-Fi and is connected to a bunch of other communities, to Aguascalientes, to Jalapa, to Ciudad Juárez. And well, we're doing this research also thinking on doing it horizontally and collectively, because for us it is important to take away this individuality and to listen to the people that are, like actioning from the ground, that are doing things to improve and have a more dignified world. So we are on this first stage, and now we are passing to the second stage, that is doing a regional investigation also, because for us it is important to know what other organizations are doing as well to safeguard our human rights and to have a more dignified world. And well, this is some other things that we are doing, as well as we are working at the moment in, well, I don't know if you know that in Mexico, it's mostly, I think it's in the whole country, there is this legislation against dissemination of images. And even though it has been applauded by a lot of people, we are critic of it because of how it is presented and some of the rights that it might violate. So we are doing with several lawyers, trans feminist activists, and civil organization members from Mexico a guide to understand the legislation, like to make an anatomy of all the legislations in Mexico and to understand how it works, and to make a practical guide also based on an anti-punitivist perspective. So these are like some of the things that we are doing at the moment, even though we continuously do like on the ground work, doing workshops or doing different materials that are needed. Like we always have this perspective on what is needed by the others and how we can help with our own knowledge.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ixchel. So when thinking about this very big issue, we want to reframe the conversation as one that's not just focused on measuring the scale of the problem, because in many ways it's already been very widely measured, but moving beyond that to think about solutions and implementing solutions. And so toward that objective, NDI recently undertook a study to look at all of the reports done by civil society organizations globally on this issue and aggregating about 450 interventions on this issue by civil society organizations across every single report that we have found on this issue. And so across all 450 interventions, the 3 interventions that we identified as most frequently occurring within the broader set of interventions were around transparency, curation, and policy. So transparency initiatives, thinking about measuring the scale of abuse and creating greater transparency around the measurement systems, as well as curation. So thinking about how women users and users generally, all interventions that help women help everyone, of course, but how systems and settings can be set so that women can create safer experiences for themselves online. And then policy. So thinking about specifically policies that help address this issue. And so while we were doing this research, we also looked at a wide set of business cases. So reasons why companies should take this issue seriously. And so I'd love to ask you both, thinking about these business cases that we identified through our research as most compelling, which of these are most compelling to you? So the business cases that we identified are a more diverse user base and a more engaged community, as well as broader partnerships and new revenue streams, enhanced brand reputation, mitigating legal and regulatory risks, corporate social responsibility, innovation and market differentiation, a positive work culture, enhanced consumer trust, and advancing the democratic process. So my question to you is, when thinking about these business cases that we've compiled through the research we've done, which of these feel most compelling to you? And Ixchel, do you want to start this time?
Oh my God, I'm thinking.
Or Paulina?
Sure, not a problem. So I think that when we look at what's happening, and again, I mean, I can probably speak mostly of what's happening in my region of Latin America. I think that advancing the democratic processes and trying to improve that area is very important and significant. What we try not to do is to, and again, we work on 4 different areas at the Women's Observatory. Raising awareness, capacity building, research, and then advocacy. And so what we're seeing across the board is just we are asking way too much out of women in politics and women in public lives, activists, environmental and human rights women defenders. We're asking them to become more resilient. And that's a big problem in itself, because this issue does not live or lies within them. It's external, it's multi-factor, multi-layer, and it needs a multi-pronged solution approach. So what we're looking at is what can we identify or what we can see in democratic processes that can help us strengthen the ecosystem for women to be to use social media, not to silence them, but also what we can do in terms of creating safeguards for women participation in politics. So one of the things that we're seeing, at least in the region, and Mexico has a policy around gender political disinformation. But most lately, we've seen new definitions of what disinformation is, regardless of what's happening in Peru. In 2021, they actually passed a bill identifying gender political disinformation as a form of gender-based violence and its impact on democratic process. So that's one of the first things that I will look. While we cannot apply a cookie cutter solution, we can start looking into each context and start working on co-regulating more than self-regulation, which we know it has not worked, at least within social media platforms, or regulating, which can lead to sanction and to reducing the spaces of freedom of expression. And then the other thing that we're looking is to identify certain regulations that can help, for example, to make artificial intelligence more inclusive, to create that, because as we know, artificial intelligence is gender biased. We are feeding algorithms with our own perception of what the world is, and most of the times, actually, this is against women, unfortunately. So that's another piece that we're looking. And then finally, we are looking at this integration of the electoral system into the regulation. And what I'm trying to say here is that we're seeing, at least in Latin America, a lack of policy or a dark box when it comes to electoral processes, where in many cases anybody can create an ad, post it on social media, choose the audience, choose who they want to target, and that is not regulated within the country. So maybe I'm being too prone rule of law, but I think that that's an incentive, and those are pieces that need to be in place in order to hopefully move towards creating safeguards for women in politics.
Thank you.
Something I would say is having more diverse teams, but because on our perspective, sometimes these gender issues feel like just a check, like having a checklist on it, just like filling a void or a quote, but with no real interest in addressing the issues or having no real core in it. Maybe in some contexts it's different, but in Mexican context, it does feel like most of these spaces when it's just not like also not having this womanish perspective, but having this gender perspective, thinking it more like non-binary and trans-inclusive. I feel like that is something that is missing in Mexican context. And we can see it also from, well, in Mexico, we have this thing called Demosiva, that is the model of cyberbullying. And it has improved a lot, but it's also just seen from this womanish perspective, like men and women. And most of the spaces in Mexico are also seen like that. But if we continue to talk about gender violence just on this womanish perspective, we are leaving aside a lot of identities and corporalities that we do feel will help us understand more profoundly technology and also, well, gender-based violence. And another thing I would say also on the democratic issue, but also, well, yeah, thinking it more on this like human rights perspective, and well, Mexico being living this context of violence, and where democratic is mostly democracy is mostly just like this facade. So yeah, that will be also another thing that I will address there.
That's great. Thank you. And just an anecdote to substantiate one of Paulina's comments earlier about asking women to be resilient. Of note is that I had run for city council in the city that I live in 2021, so 2 years ago. And I unfortunately experienced a range of gender-based harms when I ran. And so now it's an election year and people have been asking if I'll be running, and I don't know that I will. It really is a lot to ask of women to overcome these very complex issues that take place online, but have real offline impacts as well. So we have about 10 minutes left. Is that right, Hallie? Or do we not?
Yeah, we're just about at time.
All right. Maybe we have time for one question?
Yep.
Okay. One question from the audience, if there's a question. And if not, maybe a final comment from our speakers to wrap up. Okay, so final comment from our speakers.
No, just reiterating what you were saying. This is a human rights issue. When we're talking about technology facilitated, I understand the perspective we're trying to have social media platforms and big tech own and become responsible about what's happening. But we cannot continue pushing this on technology. We really need to, like I said before, if we're talking about artificial intelligence, let's talk about a more inclusive approach. If we're talking about capacity building programs, let's not going to just make it about how women can learn to combat disinformation as a form of gender political violence. We really need to talk about this from a more social and human rights perspective more than a technology facilitated, because that's where academia, government, civil society, and big techs can really work together.
Absolutely.